Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11. We're going to just chat briefly about what you're doing, and then we're going to move into creating categories and themes and talk a little bit about the analysis section. And thank you so much for your comments and your feedback on these videos. It really helps me understand where you're at and what you need. So you should by now have a list of codes that you've been using to code your data. You should input that list of codes into a Word document, perhaps using the graphic organizer. You can also use an Excel sheet if you're more comfortable with that, or another kind of table. And as you move through your coding process, you're going to be experimenting with putting codes into categories or themes. And I know you've done this before. This might just be a reminder, but just kind of think, I'm going to present different ways to think about that. So you want to think about, how do codes lump together? And a lot of times through the process of coding, you end up lumping some codes and then deciding one actually belongs somewhere else. So they move around in the process of coding. So as you finalize this process of coding, you start to think about, what does that theme together mean, and that's where your memos come in. You've been hopefully memoing the whole time, and so now you have certain memos attached to certain codes and certain themes, all right? And that graphic organizer that I gave you, the descriptive analysis graphic organizer, helps you to do that. It's like all in one place. So here's an example of a set of codes that I then moved into themes. So these are sources of ambiguity as people try to understand how to deal with science education. So these are areas that people don't understand, or they're like wondering about as they're trying to figure out how to support science education, all right? So the original codes are over here: changes in testing, communication issues, curriculum sequencing, lack of lessons for NGSS, lack of materials for science, right? These are all things that are just like, oh, what do we do with these, right? But I need to put these into categories, and putting them into categories helps me understand what's going on in the data. So you can see here, I categorize them by areas that are state policy, such as lack of time due to a focus on English language arts, math, in the Common Core standards, LCAP processing, and changes in testing. So those are state policy areas that of lack of understanding or conflict in state policy. Then there were areas within the district, things like communication issues within the district, lack of materials for science, wondering who has authority over science education as another part of district. And then I had two left over, and you can see this question mark. I was like, I'm not sure where these fit. Lack of lessons for NGSS and curriculum sequencing. So you can see how I've started to put those into categories. Now, the memo I wrote in relationship was this. What they are making sense of is not NGSS per se. It is the district and state context and the conditions of reform. So you can see, actually, this was a little bit of a surprising finding for me, because I was trying to use sense-making theory to understand, and this should be familiar to you, by the way, to understand how they're thinking about next generation science standards. And what I found out is that they're not actually thinking that much about next generation science standards. They're thinking about science in relationship to the state policy context and the district context, all right? So I say, in some ways, the sources of ambiguity are not teachers making sense of a particular pedagogical change. The participants are making sense of and figuring out and negotiating how to shift the conditions around them to support that change. As such, there are many sources of ambiguity that can, but they can be categorized coherently as state policy-oriented, district policy, or organizational culture, etc. Right? So, and you can also see how this very writing, cleaned up a little bit, could be turned into part of my findings. Now, another thing you may want, as you're like looking through those codes, start to think about, well, do some categories or codes seem to matter more than others? Are they mentioned more often? Are they mentioned by more people? So, when people mention them, is there like some emotion behind it? Like, so is there like, are they using metaphors that are very strong when they talk about things? And so you'll want to choose to talk about the categories and themes that either make the most sense for your literature or your theory, or that matter the most to your participants, or both. Another thing you want to be thinking about is, how do those themes or codes relate to each other? All right. So of course, as you're theming and categorizing, you are building a tree of codes. Some are underneath others, right? And you want to really play with that. Those of you who like to do it by hand, it's nice to write things on cards or sticky notes and actually move them around, on a whiteboard or something. Some seem to show up regularly in relationship to others. So, for example, the idea of resistance often came up in teacher interviews in relationship to a particular new district policy on discipline. So this is a former student example, right? So like, as they're thinking about how are teachers reacting to things, it's resisting, and it's actually this policy that they're resisting, right? You also may want to look at temporal lines of things. Like, so for example, I do some research where I look at how people explain the events that lead to science professional development, or not, as the case might be. So in this case of this example, accountability pressure and Common Core and the demographics all together led the district to have too many initiatives. In those initiatives, math was really championed over science, and so it was displacing science in terms of the district's support for professional development, and thus there was no science professional development. So you can see there's kind of a causal chain that I've built out of interview data as people describe what has happened. I want to show you another way to do relationship between codes, and I'm going to get back to this piece I described earlier, where I took this set of codes of things that people were struggling with, grappling with as they tried to think about how to do NGSS, how I moved them into state and district and maybe this other category. And then I actually looked at the relationships between these using a figure. So that's another way. Those of you who like drawing things up, I highly encourage you to take some blank paper and really sketch out, like, is it circles? Is it overlapping? Is it arrows? Like, what's going on between these codes? You might want to do it on a whiteboard. Some of you really like doing it in a computer. But here you can see where I ended up. And again, you've seen this before in the paper I've showed you, that I was like, the things that they're making sense of, some of them are more specific to NGSS, that's the green arrow. Some of them are more district related, that's the blue arrow. And some of them are related to other state policies, that's the light blue arrow at the bottom. And of course, they're somewhat interrelated. So on the far left, you have knowledge of how NGSS relates to old standards. That's very specific to NGSS. In the middle, you have, understanding how to support teachers shifting their practice. That's kind of both district and NGSS, right? And on the far right, you have culture and communications of question and authority at the district level, right? And the same with other state policies. There's state policies that are very sort of external to the district, and there's state policies that are very central to the district, like the LCAP plan. So I was attempting to organize the codes in a way that kind of could tell a story. And coding and writing of qualitative findings, in essence, is really telling a story. So those of you that is a genre that you love and feel comfortable with, so you can also think about it in that way. Okay, so take some time right now to go back to your codes and really play around with organizing them. Again, I recommend you write them on a piece of paper. You use maybe some unique ways to move them around and try to see how they all fit together. And that you maybe do some blank paper, some drawing, and that sort of thing. So pause the video. I'm going to move on after this to talking about writing up your analysis section. Okay, so soon you're going to have do a paragraph on how you did your analysis. All right. Just like everything else that you do, you will need to cite relevant authors, and you all have read books about how to do analysis in your area, so you can cite those books. And in your methods section, a lot of it is just really writing down what you did. In an analysis, I know many of you have remarked upon how you have to be super detailed, and that's true in the analysis as well. You just really want to write down exactly what you did in a high level of detail. All right, so it's a paragraph describing how you analyze the data, including to what extent was your approach deductive, like guided by existing theory or literature, versus inductive, emerging from the data? Or was it a combination of both? And what coding scheme did you use? And of course, Saldana has all kinds of ideas. You can go to him. And how did you generate themes? Those are the sorts of things you should answer in your analysis section. Here is an example. I'm going to give you two. This is an example from one of my studies. Our goal for analysis was to understand and document the capitals indicated by participants as activating or obstructing opportunities for science-specific professional development. So, first sentence was, here's what I want to do, all right? The second sentence says, we first coded all data using the levels of organizational capacity as a deductive framework while allowing specific resources to emerge from the data. So I'm saying we use a particular theoretical framework as a deductive framework, so applied on top of the data. But we allowed specific codes to emerge from the data. And then I justify it in order to understand how capitals function in context. Then I give an example to help the reader understand a little bit better. For example, we defined organizational structures a priori, which is this like annoying philosophy term that essentially means we defined it beforehand, but we allowed specific organizational structures salient to science reform efforts to emerge from the data. So I'm kind of repeating what I said in the sentence before, but I'm giving an example. I'm getting a little more specific. This is another example of, this is actually one of the studies that is available under Blackboard as an example study. And this person says, once I had a good overall picture of the content of the transcripts, I generated initial codes and applied these codes throughout the data. Because the research questions guided the first and second interviews were different, I conducted two separate data analyses. So he's describing what's going on. After I systematically applied initial codes to the data set, I grouped these codes into categories that cohered or clustered together, and note the citation, and what Brown and Clark called searching for themes, or what grounded theory researchers might call axial coding. I cut apart the entire data set and reorganized it by collating data items into categories. So this person is now describing how they created categories. Next, I developed themes for each interview by collapsing categories and judging for internal and external homogeneity. In other words, they're making sure that everything in those categories kind of matched. So you can see again how they're really fairly detailed in the way that they explain exactly what they did in their analysis paragraph. Okay, so pause the video here, and I just recommend you immediately take a moment to like try to write up your analysis paragraph. I don't think it will take you that long to just jot down, well, what exactly is it that you did? Did you start with in vivo? Did you start with applying your theoretical framework? Was it both? Did you go back and forth? You can even talk about how messy it is. Did you read through the data and like, make some notes and then figure out, well, these are the codes and these aren't the codes? All of that is fine. Just write it up. Okay, so one note about findings, I'm going to go over findings more in depth when we meet together, our next face-to-face meeting. But I want to let you know that the findings for the pilot study, you only need to write up one theme. So that's not very far away in terms of the due date. So you need to be thinking about this, after you organize your codes and so forth into themes, really be thinking about, okay, how, let me start thinking about how to write my findings up. I've got my memos, I've got my codes, I've got my themes. So your theme is usually your heading. Your codes might be subheadings. But for each code, for each area at any rate that you want to talk about, I'm going to give you a little preview. I recommend thinking about it just like we teach in science education, which is this idea of claim, evidence, and reasoning, except the reasoning goes in your discussion. So I'm going to call it claim, evidence, and analysis. Okay, and again, this is just a preview, so I'm not going to get that much into it. But the idea is you want to make a claim about what you see in your data, about what that code is all about. That might be the definition of the code. It might be what the code means or what it's doing. You want to provide evidence in the form of quotes. Usually, in the case of quantitative research, it would be numbers. And then you want to provide analysis. So you always want to analyze that quote or those numbers for your reader. Okay, so just a little bit of a preview. And again, I know you've done some thinking about this already. The other thing you'll need to have in your findings is a couple of paragraphs that relates that one theme to other themes in your work. Okay, so that's the video for this week. I hope you have a lovely and fantastic week.